Hello, Build Peace. How are you all doing? Good. Okay, thanks for being with us this weekend. It's now my great pleasure to introduce someone who has been an inspiration and an incredible mentor to me. Some of you know him as one of the founders of Global Voices. Some of you may know him as the chairman of Ushahidi. Some of you may know him as the author of a wonderful book called Rewire. When he's in this building, we normally know him as the director of the Center for Civic Media. He is a movement builder, a technologist, a visionary, but most importantly, he's a doer. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Ethan Zuckerman.
You'd never know that I was grading his master's thesis after this, would you? So before we get started, let me just start by saying thank you all for being here. Thank you for, first of all, still being in this room after a really brain-expanding and heavily engaged day. I really appreciate that everyone is still with us. While I'm appreciating people, let me start with a round of applause for everyone who's spoken and presented here. This has been pretty incredible. It's been a really remarkable range of folks, a wonderful range of formats, and I've learned an enormous amount even in sort of the short time that I've been able to be with us. But I think we really owe the round of applause to Rodrigo and Elena and all the other organizers who've done something really remarkable here. They've taken a really fascinating, really provocative idea, brought together a lot of people who don't get the chance to talk together every day, and I think they really deserve our thanks and applause. So let's share that with them. So it's been really an honor for MIT and for Center for Civic Media to host this event. And if I were a better host, I would do what hosts do when they give the closing keynote at a conference, which is I would try to sum up all the conversations that I've had here. I would try to pull a theme out and sort of give you a big overall picture. And thank God I didn't try to do that, because this really has been all over the map. So I'm going to do the truly unforgivable. I'm going to talk about the last conference that I was at. And I'm going to talk about the last conference that I was at because, and I didn't have language for it at the time, but it turns out it is very much a conference about building peace. It was a conference in Yangon, Myanmar, and believe it or not, it was a conference on freedom of the press in Myanmar. And I have to say, the reason I accepted the invitation to come and give a talk about freedom of the press in Myanmar was I could not believe that someone was inviting me to give a talk about freedom of the press in Myanmar. But this has a lot to do with how radically that country is transforming and how rapidly. And to give us an example of just how quickly Myanmar is changing and how Myanmar is changing, one of the speakers showed this slide. And this slide was from the government's official newspaper. It still exists, New Light of Myanmar. You can pick it up at any newsstand. But New Light of Myanmar had put up this wonderful, the people's desire, we favor peace and stability. We will not allow ourselves to be swayed by killer broadcasts from the Voice of America and the BBC. And of course, we're looking at this slide as we're all sitting in a room with people from Democratic Voice of Burma, BBC, Radio Free Asia. So this is 2011 and 2014. We're sitting in the room with the same people who are publishing New Light of Myanmar, sort of talking about how these guys are now getting along with the BBC, Radio Free Asia, and all of the other people designed to sway people with killer broadcasts. And so the other big change that's happened in Myanmar in this period of time is you've seen the internet, which was basically non-existent, open up. And open up to the point where you walk on pretty much any street corner and you'll find people selling stuff associated with Facebook, associated with getting online. So I'm here, I'm looking at this is sort of remarkable. Different measures of press freedom now say that the press in Myanmar is significantly freer than it is in Singapore, significantly freer than it is in Malaysia. And I start talking to people about what are the challenges? What's it like working in this new environment? And the first thing that people say to me is, we've got to do something about online speech. It's really dangerous. which is a little strange, right? I'm here as an American, First Amendment. The first thing I expect to hear is, this is great, we have the internet, we can say whatever we want to say, press censorship is gone, we've got complete free speech. And in fact, what's happening is guys like Nay is a blogger who was arrested during the Saffron Revolutions of 2007. He'd been writing about the Saffron Revolutions for an international audience. He's arrested and sentenced to a 20-year term in jail. He gets released along with a whole slate of political prisoners in 2012. And I talked to him, and one of the first things he says to me is, I want to stamp out hate speech on Facebook. And you're sort of looking at this and going, well, wait a second, like what's going on here? I need to understand. There's something here that I don't fully understand. And the main thing that I don't fully understand, the main thing that a democratic activist like Nay is trying to get across is that in a country like Myanmar, where you have massive ongoing ethnic conflicts, the rise of technology, the rise of free speech environments may actually mean the rise of tension. So many of us in this audience, some following it very closely, some less closely, most people are following the conflict in Rakhine State, where you have a large population of Rohingya Muslims who have lived in this state. In some cases, families have lived there for multiple centuries. But you have the government and you have local people essentially declaring the Rohingya visitors, invaders, immigrants. The least political charged term you're likely to hear is Bangladeshis, which basically denies their presence within Myanmar nationhood. But there's much, much more violent speech than that, and violent speech that is accompanied by violent acts like the burning of the mosque in the background of this photograph. And a lot of this is coming from Buddhist monks, which is another thing where if you're an ignorant American, instead of looking at this, you go, wait a second, aren't these the peaceful guys that we're all supposed to look up to? And in many cases, the Buddhist monks are actually the guys building movements designed to marginalize the Muslim population of Myanmar. There's a movement called 969, which has been started by this monk who has been basically preaching against intermarriage, has been preaching a boycott of Muslim businesses by Buddhist businesses, and has become something of a star on the Burmese internet. You see a huge number of his videos circulated. You see people passing it back and forth on disk, but you see it increasingly in online spaces. And this is what people are really terrified about, that essentially these movements, essentially towards Buddhist superiority, promoting violence against Muslims, are going to find a space online that they've had a hard time finding a space for in the physical world, even though in the physical world there's obvious rampant conflict between the Buddhist majority and a Muslim minority within Myanmar. So the other thing that I didn't understand until I hit the ground was that the internet in Myanmar is a little different than the internet in the rest of the world, which is to say, the rest of the world has had about 20 years to get used to the consumer internet. And depending on what country you're in, different networks might have different prominence. You might use different tools. Most people use Google to search, but there are some countries where Twitter is really popular. Orkut still matters in Brazil. LiveJournal matters in Russia. But in Myanmar, you have a whole group of people who came online for the first time in 2012. And the internet is Facebook. There is nothing else. If you are going to search for something on the web, you go to Facebook and you search on Facebook. And when you find it, it is the Facebook page associated with something. If you're a business in Myanmar and you want to have a business web page, you don't hire a firm to build you a web page. You start a page for your brand on Facebook. It's all there is. It's not that the rest of the internet is blocked. It's that when you get online in 2012 and the most powerful brand that's out there is Facebook, that's what your internet ends up looking like. And this, as it turns out, may be particularly problematic. So let me say, this is a vision that makes this guy pretty happy. He's pretty thrilled with the idea that there's a nation of potentially 50 million internet users who basically think that the internet is Facebook. But one of the things that Zuckerberg really likes to make the case for is that Facebook right now is a network that's connecting us all globally. This image, by the way, is the same image that sort of shows up on that monitor there. It's an image that's become part of Facebook's rhetoric. It was put together by an intern named Paul Butler in 2010. And the idea behind this image was, if you just visualize every connection on Facebook, if you see who's connected to who, pretty clearly you'll see the entire world is united by Facebook. We are all just a couple of degrees away from one another. At this point at a peace conference, we can all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. The trick with this is, like any visualization, it's political. It's made certain choices. And what you don't see in this visualization is that the truth of Facebook is that the vast majority of us are connected mostly to people in our own country. We're connected mostly to people in our own state. We're connected mostly to people who we know purely from the offline world, people who we've gone to school with, people who we worked with. If we're lucky, if we're the sort of people in this room who have a lot of international connections, we may well be the arcs sort of holding this map together. But for most people on Facebook, we are those white dots of people who are highly connected to other people who are around them. I got so interested in this map that I started going to Facebook to try to get the data out of them to actually understand what's going on. And what I figured out working with some of Facebook's researchers is that if you take the average across the board, the average Facebook user has about 150 friends, and the average Facebook user has 13% international contacts, which is crazy, right? It's really high. It's an amazing place. But the average person in this room has one breast and one testicle. It's not a very good statistic when you're trying to figure out a whole set of people. When you're actually looking at individual people within this set, it turns out that about 90% of people on Facebook have almost 100% local friends. And there's a small set of people on Facebook who are very internationally connected. They're often people who are living abroad. If you are Burmese and you're living in Singapore, 90% of your contacts register as international contacts because you're staying in touch with people at home in Myanmar, and you send that whole average up. But for most people, Facebook basically ends up being a way of having a comfortable sphere of people you already know about, already talk to, or already connected to, who travel with you wherever you go in the world. And what this means is if you are a Buddhist from Rakhine State, and someone posts this photo of a shop that has put up this 969 logo, essentially saying, support us because we are Buddhist, and we are opposed to intermarriage of Muslims and Buddhists, and we support the boycott of Muslim-owned shops, you're more likely to look at this and say, well, everybody else I know is a Buddhist from Rakhine who's online. I'm likely to see this image pretty often. And if you don't have people in your immediate circle of friends on Facebook, and odds are that you don't, who represent the Rohingya minority, you may be more inclined to let this pass, to not say anything about it, to like it, to share it, to sort of pass it along. And this is what's terrifying people like Nifo and Let. They're really worried that Facebook is creating this space for speech where it is alarmingly easy to engage in dangerous speech. It's really, really easy to engage in dangerous speech because you assume that you are talking mostly to your friends. You assume that your friends have enough common background with you in terms of ethnic origin and religious origin that they're not going to object to you saying this. They may not stand in front of you and sort of say, hey, take that back, that's not a good thing to be saying. Basically, what they're assuming is homophily. And homophily is this sort of 25-cent SAT word that turns out to be remarkably helpful and actually very, very simple, because all it means is it's the human tendency of birds of a feather to flock together. And homophily is probably the best documented phenomenon in sociology. You can go and read some of the literature reviews on this, and what you'll find is that sociologists have found evidence that people, given a choice, will sort themselves by race, by ethnicity, by religion, by income. People are remarkably good at sort of finding similarities with other people, even if they're non-obvious. And they'll sort themselves within rooms. You can look at some of this literature, and people will sort themselves by the silliest, most arbitrary of visible characteristics. People have done a study where going into a computer lab, people with long hair will sit next to other people with long hair. People with glasses will sit next to other people with glasses. When you interview them after the fact, they'll say, he looked friendly. People sort themselves based on this inherent ability to sort of find our tribe. And it's one of the best documented tendencies in human society. A lot of political systems actually have explicit ways of trying to counter this, trying to mix this. You can think about school busing. You can think about what universities do to sort of make sure that you have diversity in your freshman class. And they do it because we really have to fight it because it is our natural tendency. Facebook is the first online business I know of that has made homophily its business model. Facebook basically exists to sort of say, let me give you as comfortable and familiar a set of people as possible, because the internet out there is really broad and scary. You don't want to talk to those random anonymous people who you don't know anything about. They might be very different from you. Why don't we have a network instead where if you're from Harvard, you can mostly talk to other people from Harvard? And that's the DNA of the network, and it's very much where that network's gone over time. And this may be a perfectly reasonable thing as long as Facebook's ambitions are to give you a Facebook, to give you the chance to sort of know the people in your immediate social circle. But when Facebook becomes a broker of information, when Facebook becomes the way that you get news about the world, when Facebook becomes the interface with which you understand what's going on online, i.e. the way it's being used in Myanmar, and maybe some other chunks of the world, particularly if you look at youth behavior on Facebook, it starts getting very scary and very dangerous. It starts looking like an echo chamber. Now, the echo chamber is a term that Cass Sunstein came up with to talk about his fears of what happened in certain types of online discourse. Sunstein was really afraid of the notion that we might personalize our newspapers. He was really scared of a technology that came here out of the Media Lab called the Freshman Fish Wrap, put together by a guy named Pascal Chenet, who let you customize yourself a newsletter that got sent to you every morning. And Sunstein looked at this and said, look, over time, this is terrible for us as a society. It's not just that I'm only going to get baseball scores about the Red Sox, it's that I'm only going to get political news from the left wing. And eventually, I'm going to lose my ability to talk to people who disagree with me on basic political subjects because we simply won't have the same facts in common. We won't be able to debate because we won't have the same things to debate. And he went off and started doing studies on this. He started looking at what happened to political deliberation when you were in a like-minded group. And he went into Boulder, Colorado. He sorted people into groups on the left, groups on the right. He had them debate on a topic like gun control. And it turns out that if you have opinions on gun control, and I'm in favor of more gun control, and you debate with more people who have opinions on gun control and share your opinion, you end up becoming more extreme. If you are a 3 on the scale of saying, you know, the Second Amendment is the most important amendment in the US Constitution, and you go into a room of 8 more people who are on the 1 to 5 side of the line, if you're a 3, you're going to come out a 2. And this sort of happens again and again. You get the confirmation bias that everybody feels the same way you do, and it tends to actually push you further in your views. And this may be part of what people are worried about when you start worrying about what Facebook might be doing in Myanmar with the Rakhine and the Rohingya having a harder and harder time acknowledging or talking to one another. And the third point that I sort of want to make in this, which is the bad news part of this lecture, it is going to twist in a moment, but in the bad news part of this lecture is the idea that technology has politics. And I don't mean this in the sense that people hope that Twitter is going to finally change Turkey. I mean this in a very different sense. When we build technologies, we have certain visions as developers of technologies of how we expect people to interact with one another. Facebook has certain assumptions. Facebook assumes that real friends are people who know each other by real names in the real world. If you think about Facebook, when you logged into Facebook for the first time, it asked to mine your email to find the people that you were really talking to. It then asked you where you went to school and where you worked, so it could find people that you knew face to face. That is a political decision. Facebook made a political decision about what they think a real friendship is. Facebook could work completely differently. If we were sitting here at Building Peace and decided to build a new Facebook, We might build a Facebook that essentially said, hey, Ethan, you're a white liberal from Massachusetts. Let's find you some conservative friends from the Deep South. And if it were smart about it, it might even look for sort of common ground. It might sort of say, by the way, Ethan, you're a Green Bay Packers fan. Let me find you Green Bay Packers fans who are conservative people of color from the South. So at least you'll have something in common, and you're not likely just to dismiss them. And before you decide that that's completely absurd and no one would ever design a network that way, go back a little bit in time. In many ways, that's what Usenet was, sort of the earliest social network that any of us really played with online, where you came in and said, you know what, I'm interested in alt.culture.sumo. I don't care where you are or who you are, I just want to talk about sumo with you. Now, there may be some biases. It turns out a lot of big guys are into sumo. You know, there may be other biases sort of associated with this, but it's not that same bias of finding exactly who it was in your homophilous circle. So these are the 3 big points that I wanted to make sort of at the beginning of this. Left to our own devices, we often tend into these groups of the like-minded. These groups of the like-minded, these groups of people from the same origin, are probably really bad for democracy in that we tend to end up in this sort of polarized camps that Jonathan Stray was talking about in his session earlier, and it gets harder and harder to have that sort of interactive democratic discourse. And that technology is never a neutral player in this space. When you make decisions about how people are going to interact online, you are making political decisions. Small p political, not big P political. So the book that I wrote last summer, this is basically the first half of it, and it's the bad news piece of the book. And one of the reasons the book isn't selling very well, I think, is the first 200 pages are bad news. But I promise it gets better, right? It really does get better, because I think we can take that last principle, that idea that technology has politics, that idea that we can use these tools to try to govern how behavior happens, and we can use this to try to build tools that help us understand our biases and our blind spots and to try to figure out how to see around them. So we're now getting into cool stuff, which means I'm responsible for very, very little of it. It's mostly by my students, and I'm going to try to acknowledge as we go through it. But I wanted to show this piece first. This is a piece done by a master's student of mine, Catherine D'Ignazio. And on its simplest level, this is a map of the Boston Globe. This is simply a way of taking every story that our local newspaper has published in the Boston metro area and putting it up on a map. And she's done something sort of interesting with this. She's mapped stories in terms of stories per capita. So essentially, how many stories per people in these different communities. And predictably, Boston itself has a ton of stories, and it makes sense. We're the center of government. Any story about Massachusetts state government is going to end up there. But then there's some sort of weird stuff. This area out here in the western part of town is basically where you live in Boston if you have money. Lots and lots of money. These are very expensive communities, and they are disproportionately represented in terms of stories per capita. And there are also some communities that are disproportionately underrepresented. These communities are generally poor and have high populations of color. These communities are generally poor, and they're historically poor and white, although they're changing over time. And so looking at this starts giving you a sense of what you might be getting and not be getting out of the Boston Globe. But she went a step further as well and sort of said, what do we talk about when we talk about these communities? So here's an analysis on what's going on in Mattapan. Mattapan's a majority community of color, neighborhood of Boston, pretty far from Cambridge, as you're hanging out in now, economically disadvantaged. And as we talk about it, you'll start seeing certain words showing up here. Juror, police, jury, testimony, shooting shows up there somewhere, officers. We've been watching this for a while, and it turns out that the word that shows up again and again and again in Mattapan is shooting. So it turns out we basically got 2 types of stories. We get crime stories and basketball stories. Shooting shows up in both. But these stories are mostly about killing. And this has been the portrait that's been generated of Mattapan over a period of time. Now, this isn't that someone in the Globe's newsroom sat down and said, you know what would be great? Why don't we write lots of happy stories about, the western suburbs, and why don't we make things look really bad in Mattapan? This is the product of thousands of individual news judgments. This is the product of what we expect to be news. This is an implicit, not an explicit bias. This isn't anyone's order that crime's going to sell newspapers, so go out and find a murder in Mattapan. This is a combination of sociological factors that have to do with the fact that there is a disproportionate amount of violence in the community, and that this is what ends up being the story about it. But when we can start making these things clear, we can start having a very different conversation. We can look at this and say, is this a fair portrait of Mattapan? Is this, in fact, an accurate reflection of what's going on the ground? What are we missing about Mattapan that isn't coming into this conversation? So we've been doing this work for the Boston Globe. We're now trying to figure out how to take this work global. And we're now getting to the point where we can take a news source like the New York Times and essentially say, where in the world are you looking? And what are you looking at when you're looking there? When we talk about Myanmar, what story are we telling? My friends in Myanmar would tell you that in the New York Times, when we're talking about Myanmar, we're talking about the Rohingya again and again and again. And they would claim that that's actually very unfair, and that we are over-focused on an ethnic conflict in one particular state. We are under-focused on the way the government is opened up. We're under-focused on the ways the economy is growing. But one way or another, if we can start watching and looking at tools to understand this, we can understand what sort of patterns might be emerging and what problems we might see. Like the problem when you let the Huffington Post cover your news, you may have discovered that this continent, this sort of big one in the middle here, just sort of disappears from the map. It turns out that in HuffPo's internationalization, they've missed a couple of continents. I'm sure they're going to get there, but if we look at it in aggregate, it's possible that they might have an Africa problem at this sort of stage of the game. It's also possible, by the way, that some of us in the audience may have an Africa problem. And so where Catherine has gone with this work, which I think is really interesting, is she's basically said, look, it's not enough just to show what a source is good at paying attention to or not. We need to think about what we individually are good at paying attention to. So Catherine's new tool is called Terra Incognita. And if you want, you can sign up for this. You put a plugin into your Chrome browser. It browses over your shoulder. And every time you access a news site, and we've got a whitelist of about 5,000 news sites, anytime you go to a news site, Terra Incognita looks to see what country it's about, what place it's about. And this little bar on the bottom of the screen starts crossing off a list of the world's 1,000 largest cities. So if you read an article about this conference and it's said in Boston, you'll get a check mark for Boston. It'll show up as one of your black lines there. And every time you open a new browser tab in Chrome, you'll get a city you haven't read about. And it's oriented so that if you're reading a lot of North America and Europe, you're going to get much more Africa and Asia. So if you're reading a lot of North America, there's a decent chance you're going to open up to a tab of Brazzaville. It's going to suggest readings that you might read about Brazzaville. In this case, it's showing you things that you have read about Brazzaville. You can compete with other people for who's read the most about Brazzaville, who's made the best content recommendation about Brazzaville. You can use this as a way of trying to sort of conquer the world by seeing how much of it you can see. You can also use it as a way of sort of identifying what are great ways to sort of help other people explore. It's interesting. We're having some fun challenges in putting this together. It turns out that when you pick the 1,000 largest cities in the world, 400 of them are in China. And when you start looking at these sort of third and fourth tier Chinese cities, and you're looking for a reading in English to help an English speaker decide they might want to pay more attention to some place in China, surprisingly tough task. If anybody has a great archive of content, telling us what to read about smaller Chinese cities, we could really, really use the help. But it's a provocation. It's the notion that if we can build systems that help us see what we see and what we don't see, and help nudge us in different directions on content, it may be able to help us sort of change our behavior. We're also looking at systems that help us try to get a sense for what we might have in common. This is work done by Ed Platt. I don't know if Ed's in the audience. He's been at the conference today. But Ed's been doing just beautiful work looking at top videos on YouTube and essentially saying, okay, every country, over a certain user population, YouTube will post what are the most popular videos on any given day or week on YouTube. And if you start putting this together, you can start seeing some very interesting patterns. certain countries tend to like the same thing at the same time. I spend a lot of time in West Africa. Ghana and Nigeria like the same videos, something like 50% of the time. If it's trending in Ghana, it's probably trending in Nigeria. There's a decent chance that it's going to trend in Kenya and sort of move across the globe that way. There's also weird stuff that we never would have expected. It turns out that the US and the Netherlands have an enormous amount in common in their video watching taste. We sort of watch this over time. And what's interesting is it ends up being this sort of very strange form of global remote control. You can use this site to sort of figure out what's really hot right now in Algeria. You can use it to figure out what Algeria and France think is hot at the same time. You can look for countries that have the least in common and try to figure out what they all agree on is interesting. It turns out that when you get to those countries that are very, very distant, don't have a ton in common culturally, they all watch certain music videos and they all watch Google ads. Like the Google Plus ads that make you cry because the girl is far away from home and she shows her diamond ring to her father. Huge everywhere in the world. It sort of succeeds everywhere. But I actually think that video, and even very, very silly videos, may turn out to be even more powerful for us once we figure out how to use them. I think we don't just want to map what we're seeing, what we're not seeing with technology. I think in many cases we can start looking for opportunities to try to bring people together across great distances and sort of great cultural boundaries. And for that, I bring you Pharrell. So Pharrell Williams, hugely successful musical producer, involved with pretty much every hot song of this year, did something really interesting with a video for his song, Happy. Released a video that is 24 hours long. And it basically involves him walking down different streets in LA, lots and lots of other celebrities showing up. It became something of a phenomenon because people would watch this 24-hour video and would sort of find their favorite moment in it, where at 5 a.m., he runs into Odd Future or, some sort of underground hip-hop stars. It's an incredibly cool thing. What he probably did not count on is that it turns out to be incredibly easy to make your own. So there has long been the phenomenon of people trying to figure out how to make what I call the geo-remix. Take something like Jay-Z's Empire State of Mind and turn it into Accra State of Mind. Take Psy's Gangnam Style, turn it into Klingon style, or turn it into the style for whatever community you're within. And it turns out that Happy is absolute catnip for this. The video is incredibly simple. All you really have to do is go out on the street, get people dancing happily to something. And what's happened is that it turns out that more than 1,000 people have made versions of Happy at this point coming out of 109 different countries, showing up in places like Niamey. Sunshine, she's here, you can take a break. Or in Beijing. I'm a hot air balloon that could go to space. With the air, and by the way, I totally recommend this as a way to spend an evening if you're bummed out. My wife and I were kind of having a rough night the other night, and we basically sat around and looked at Happy videos for about 3 hours. But I actually want to make the case that there's something really interesting going on here. And the case that I want to make is that, first of all, when you start looking at these videos, they're a very interesting tour of the world, right? If you don't have any mental picture of Niamey, it's really wonderful to sort of have 4 minutes of sort of walking around the streets of the city and just trying to get a sense of who's there. And by the way, for Africa, this may be particularly important because if you have any picture of Niamey, you may be thinking of drought, of starvation, so on and so forth. It's an interesting corrective to essentially get 4 minutes of, maybe they're the only happy people in the city, but those people are happy, let me tell you what. But the second piece that I actually think is more interesting about this is these remix projects are a way of sort of asserting yourself as part of a global whole. They're a way of quite literally putting yourself on the map. And for some of the places that show up on this, this may be a really interesting form of exposure. Here's a video for Toliara, Madagascar. Now, anyone know where Toliara is? Show of hands. Pretty global room, we got one. If anyone looks it up on Wikipedia, by the way, like it's the shortest article I have ever seen for a major city. This is not a place that gets a whole lot of visibility or a whole lot of love. But this is a way of sort of saying, we're in Toliara, we are part of this greater whole. And it's interesting, I don't think that Farrell or his videographers on this had any sense that this was going to go in this direction. If we were going to do this from a conscious sort of building peace direction, we would probably want to push this even further and essentially say, how do we get these people dancing together? How do you get that connection between Beijing and Benin and try to bring it together in one fashion or another? Right now, it's all on you as the viewer to sort of look at this and try to figure out, well, there is some really interesting common ground here. But what's interesting is that there's a shared practice. There's this common action, this ability to be part of this bigger whole that everybody's invited into and invited to take part. This is something that we've been trying to do for years over at Global Voices. We're now about 10 years into this project of inviting people from all over the world to tell us what's going on in citizen media. And so a lot of what shows up on Global Voices is what's going on in Euromaidan. And we've got people from Ukraine, we've got people from Russia, we've got people throughout Eastern Europe sort of reacting and trying to figure out what's going on. But one of the things we take an enormous amount of pride in is trying to do content that's designed to bring people together, to find those sort of unexpected connections around stuff that's as simple and as dumb as food, where we'll basically just come in and essentially say, let me talk to you about what's going on in the rhetoric around food in my community. Let's talk about what's happening. Let's find some sort of common ground where we can have a conversation, even if we've got nothing more in common than this. And we're heading to, for us, what ends up being the most interesting moment in the 4-year cycle, which is the World Cup. We celebrate the World Cup maybe slightly differently than you celebrate the World Cup. For each one of these matches, we look for bloggers from both sides, and we put them together in a chat room. So we're not looking for serious conflict, we're looking for mock conflict. There are some cases like Spain, Chile that I expect may actually be serious conflict, but what we're generally trying to do is find a blogger from Cameroon, a blogger from Brazil, putting them together in a room with people who speak both Portuguese and French, and watch that match together with their friends, their Twitter followers, their Facebook friends. And these things end up sort of becoming these fascinating 100-person watching parties where people end up sort of talking about what's great about, believe it or not, the other guy's football team. We did this in 2010. We expected this to be hugely filled with conflict. We expected this to be a complete smackdown. It actually ended up being as polite as I expect the Côte d'Ivoire-Japan game will be, where basically people sit there and say, your team is so wonderful, we are so honored to have the chance to play them. But it turns out that even when you sort of show up in this virtual space, designed for smack talk between two teams, you actually end up with an enormous amount of civility and people looking for strange and unexpected connections between these countries. I think there's a ton to be said for the notion of what happens when you take on a task together. My friend Ed Bice and his team over at Midan have been doing this really interesting and important work around trying to build a site where English and Arabic speakers can talk about the news together. And they're doing it through automated translation. You put up a site, you have it automatically translated, and then people have the ability to come in and clean up those translations, because automatic translation sucks. But having a whole community of people coming in and cleaning up the Arabic or cleaning up the English turns machine translation not just into something that's much more readable, but turns this into a community affair where people are bought into the idea. And when you're working on that collective of having people talk about the news and comment on the news and have a truly inclusive conversation, whether it's about football or whether it's about deeply political news like what's going on in Syria, really amazing things sort of come out of this. And I realize that this is a lousy example of how this works at scale, but this is part of what's been so amazing about watching Global Voices, is that we've found that conflicts in our community, particularly conflicts between Israel and the Arab world, which are incredibly persistent and one of the hardest things for us to deal with as a project that wants to represent Israeli views as well as views from throughout the Arab world, the notion of having 10 years of practice leads to some fascinating stuff on the interpersonal level. This is Gilad Lotan, one of the best data scientists in the world right now. He's also one of our Israeli correspondents. This is Amira Al-Husani. She's an activist and a blogger out of Bahrain. These guys did not start out very friendly. But Gilad worked for Amira for 4 years, producing posts every week, having her as his editor in English. And over the course of 4 years, they've ended up becoming incredibly close and have sort of carved out a space for Gilad in a team that is otherwise all Arabs. And this has been pretty incredible. We spent 4 years going through an Israeli correspondent every 2 months. We would simply iterate through them. They would go away. It was too hostile a community. And then we had Gilad coming in and say, hey, you know, first of all, former IDF, former Israeli Defense Forces. Second of all, former intelligence for Israeli Defense Forces. Third of all, actually pretty proud of it and happy to explain to you why. And fourth of all, totally committed to this project and totally committed to all the shit I'm about to get for the last 3 things I just said. And over the course of 4 years of this practice of working together, you now have a set of interpersonal bonds that may well have changed the perspective of a lot of people working on this. So my first point was technology may give us a chance to look at what we're seeing and what we're not seeing. The second is that technology sometimes gives us a chance to work together on the joint project and sort of generate the social capital that we might not have elsewhere. I've really been interested in this third question, coming in here to talk to you today, about what we could do to use technology directly to confront questions of peacemaking. Now, as Rodrigo mentioned in his intro, I've been very involved with Ushahidi from the start. You guys probably know the story behind Ushahidi. After the 2007 elections, a group of Kenyans got together to build a tool to document post-election ethnic violence and political violence, put it up on a map. That ended up becoming a platform that we could use for lots of other things, whether it was for relief in Haiti or tracking snow in Washington, D.C. It's proven to be a very successful tool, success story on a lot of different fronts. What most people don't know is it isn't the only tech project that that group of people were working on in the wake of the 2007 elections. And in many ways, this was at least as important. This was a website put together by a guy named David Kobia, who's the tech head for Ushahidi. And at the time that things fell apart in Kenya in 2007, he was running a message board called Basada, which was the most popular Kenya-focused message board. And this became utterly intolerable to run because all people were posting on this message board were horrific threats of one group against another. And after burning out moderator after moderator after moderator, David got up one morning, he took down the website, he came back 2 days later with this site, I have no tribe, I am Kenyan. And basically said, look, here's my manifesto. I'm not providing a space for that speech anymore. If you want to speak, you're going to speak about what I want to speak on, which is that we have a national identity that transcends those ethnic identities. And it didn't work perfectly. Lots and lots of people used I have no tribe to essentially say, what the hell are you talking about? Of course I have a tribe. But at least as many people used it to sort of say, look, you got a point. I get it. You know, let's think about how we get through this. Let's think about this idea that none of us want to see this nation fall apart. We want to figure out how we come together and go forward as Kenya. So when Kenya headed into elections in 2012, some of the folks involved with Ushahidi are involved with a group called the iHub, technology incubator in Nairobi, along with Susan Benesch, who's here in the audience, I hope. Susan is one of the leading thinkers on countering dangerous speech. And so by bringing Susan's expertise along with Ushahidi and iHub's expertise in monitoring social media, they decided to put together a project monitoring what went on in social media and dangerous speech around the Kenyan elections. And what they ended up finding was that there was a good bit of dangerous speech. There was a good bit of speech that could be seen as incitement to violence. But what was particularly interesting is it happened on Facebook and it didn't happen on Twitter. And if it sounds at this point like I'm just here to bash Facebook, that actually isn't what I'm trying to do. It's more a question of thinking about those models. On Facebook, it's really easy to post only for that group of friends, for people who you expect to have the common background. On Twitter, something really different happens. And the thing that's different is Kenyans on Twitter. And if you follow Kenya at all, you probably know this hashtag. This is an incredibly robust community of digitally savvy Kenyans who used this very brief hashtag to basically say, this is a conversation I want to be having with the rest of Kenya. And if you were stupid enough to tweet incendiary speech with the hashtag KOT, you experienced a phenomenon called KOT cutting, which is to say that community cut you off. And they would cut you off by essentially saying, we do not accept that speech. This is not okay within a Kenyan context. We are not going to have that sort of dialogue and represent Kenya to the world that way. So either you take it back or we're unfollowing and cutting you guys off. Now this, as Susan has argued, this goes completely counter to what we're told to do with trolls, right? We're told not to give them attention, we're told not to address them. This is exactly the opposite. This is basically saying, I don't think you really mean that. I'm going to give you a chance to take it back, and if you don't, I want you to step back from that because I don't want you representing our country this way. What's fascinating is how well it worked. There was a wave of people engaged in incendiary speech, and then a wave of people basically backing off from it and apologizing from it. And then after that initial wave, there was almost no incendiary speech on Twitter. Now, unfortunately, there was still quite a bit of it on Facebook. But it raises this very interesting question that we might be able to make a decision that we're going to watch and confront and address cases where people are using technology against the purposes that we want as people who are trying to build peace. So this has been fascinating for me because I've been thinking about this question of hate speech in Myanmar. And on Friday, I started seeing my Burmese friends start posting very interesting images on Twitter. And in these images, they were holding flowers in their mouth, usually jasmine flowers. Jasmine's pretty interesting. Jasmine gets handed out to you, sometimes just when you're walking down the street in Rangoon. But it often gets handed to you when you're at a temple or just out of a temple. It's a very common Buddhist gift as a way of sort of signifying peace, positive karma. And so this movement called Panzagar had people putting jasmine in their mouths, essentially saying, I want you to think about what you're saying. I want you to think about what your speech is doing. And of course, part of what's interesting in this is that Ne Phon Let is the guy leading this. So the guy who spent 5 years in prison for what he wrote online is now thinking about this question of how do we use speech in this new environment? And what does it mean to use speech in a way that's going to take us towards peace? And of course, being Myanmar, where this is actually unfolding, is entirely on Facebook, as people are trying to figure out how to build this up and sort of build a movement around all of this. So at the end of this, I wanted to make a really simple point, which is that there's absolutely no guarantee that as the world gets more connected, as it gets more wired, that technology is going to bring us towards peace. In fact, this is an aspiration that everybody has had for every new technology. You go back and you look at the history of the telegraph, you look at the history of television, you look at the history of the airplane, everybody thinks technology is going to make us one and make us peaceful. And in fact, I would argue for internet technology, there's a really good chance that if we don't think about how we're using it, think about what we're doing with it, it's probably going to do the opposite. But the good news in all of this is that we build technologies. We can choose what they get used for and what they don't get used for. We have an incredible opportunity to look at the technologies that we use and to say to ourselves, how do we use these as technologies that we can use to build peace? So I thank you very, very much, and thank you for your patience. Rodrigo, at this point, may want to get everybody out of here and off to a bar, but if I'm allowed to stick around for a moment or two, I'm happy to take a question or two. Anybody?
Question revealing my enormous ignorance of Boston. The map of the Boston Globe, how did that relate to distribution of readership of that newspaper?
Yep. So it absolutely has certain readership correlations, and they absolutely are looking for an audience in sort of the wealthier suburbs. It has a lot to do with questions of who still buys newspapers, which tend to be people who are wealthier and who are older. But I don't think that it's okay to essentially say, as the leading newspaper, we're going to represent those who read us. I think when you're trying to report on a community and you're reporting in a society where we tax people, we redistribute income to try to deal with problems of the poor, problems of the disadvantaged, you probably want to do something very, very similar with attention. You want to make sure that you're paying attention to your most vulnerable rather than the people who are best able to take care of themselves. So we've looked for multiple correlations in it. It's actually really hard to correlate neatly to something like income. There is no straight income correlation. The best correlation I've heard suggested in all of it is that it's mostly where the editors live. And that's a hard one to suss out without actually finding everybody's home address. It's not as neat or as clean a single factor correlation as we had hoped for. I suspect subscriber base has some of it. We're trying to do something now similar with some of our local public radio stations and try to get a sense for where their donors are and what their local news coverage is from it. But I think one way or another, when you've got something which is really positions itself as the newspaper of record, it's very, very important to look at broader coverage and coverage of people who may or may not be your customers at that point. We go over here?
Just to follow up on the same point, so I'm thinking newspapers probably they would call themselves unbiased and neutral, but then there's some good actors that are documenting conflicts or like let's say Syria Tracker or Women's Under Siege, and they're actually documenting these, but with a atrocity mapping, but they're also creating a narrative. So I wanted to speak of how, in that sphere, you know, how the narratives of, let's say, Syrian women or of a victim or, you know, crimes are perpetrated over a population, how does that frame it, and what is, you know, what should we do about that?
Right. So I think one of the things that's incredibly promising about this moment in time is that if you feel like something like the voices of Syrian women aren't being adequately reflected in whatever media you're facing, no matter how objective they think or don't think they are, and I'm finding that few newspapermen or women will tell me at this point that they think that they're objective, you have the ability to sort of create that content and try to contribute to the dialogue. What you are not guaranteed of is an audience. And this is where things start getting very, very tricky. One of the reasons we pay disproportionate attention to big media sources is that they have really big audiences. And they have really big influence over what we talk about, what we don't talk about. So it's incredibly laudable that people are doing things like atrocity mapping. And it's great when we can find ways to sort of bring that into broader media dialogues. But what we now have to start thinking about is who gets to see it, who's paying attention to it, for whom is it influencing a view of a situation or a conflict. It's actually a much more complicated world to think about media and activism than it was 20 or 30 years ago, where your goal was to hit the New York Times or one of the broadcast networks in the United States. Now there's so many different channels to capture attention that you can actually have something that reaches quite a broad audience without reaching mainstream media, although mainstream media in many ways is still sort of the shortcut to get that sort of attention associated with those different points of view. Yeah, sure. I think the gentleman over here, please.
Ethan, who came to my office on Monday and said, she's doing innovation stuff for us. You should look at Happy and look at all the things that have been done with it. And, you know, being a generation older than you, it's not stuff I would ever look at normally. And I have the same response that you and your wife did. So I sent her back and said, it's been done. We can't do it again. You are a peace builder. You're a 23-year-old graduate student. Come up with an equivalent that we could do in our field. So you can do our homework for her. What an innovation, a weird innovation that we could do.
I think I disagree somewhat with how you're framing it. So first of all, I don't think it's been done once and it's never been done again. Actually, the point that I'm trying to make is that actually this phenomenon of remixing a popular video for your local cultural context happens a lot. So we've been sort of collecting examples of this over at Center for Civic Media, and we've got 4 or 5 videos that have gained sort of huge local chains of how they've been localized. And the reason it happens, by the way, is that the way that YouTube organizes, when you look at that first video, it sort of says, hey, have you seen this parody video? And then having watched that parody video, then you find the other ones, and it sort of takes us around the way. Beyond that, look, I mean, one of the things we've all learned is that surprise is great online. And so it's great to be first. It's great to be the first to think something through. My friend Mary Joyce, who's a scholar of digital activism, says maybe the only thing we've learned about digital activism is that if you're the first to use a tactic, you have a much higher chance of success. But I think there are other things that we're starting to learn. And what I would say from Happy is if you can find a way to hijack something that already has a huge amount of popular attention and bend it to your own purposes, do it. That's great. If you can find a way to build that in a way that's building peace, and I would argue that there's a case to be made that that is building peace, that's a great way to go. I would also say looking for paths that let people be creative within a frame and localize something to their own context rather than starting ex nihilo turns out to be really powerful. Giving someone a script they can follow and then making it possible to be part of a global whole seems to be a very, very powerful tactic moving forward. So I actually think, I threw it in there because it's nice at 5 p.m. to have something fun and happy in the middle of a talk. But actually, forced to defend it, I would make the case that it's actually one of the better examples out there of something that's probably getting, at this point, millions and millions of people to catch at least a momentary glimpse of some part of the world that they don't know anything about. But at this point, I'm going to yield the stage back to my good friend, Rodrigo.
Thanks so much, Ethan.